The highway stretched out like a dark ribbon through the Louisiana wetlands, endless and lonesome, a vein of cracked asphalt laid across a world that belonged to the frogs, the snakes, and the ancient cypress trees. On either side of the road, the swamp spread wide like a black ocean, the waters still as glass yet hiding unfathomable things beneath. Moonlight reflected in streaks across the surface, broken by floating islands of moss and drifting logs that might not have been logs at all. Spanish moss hung from the trees like tattered curtains, swaying in the humid breeze, heavy and damp, like the swamp itself was exhaling. The soundscape was alive, a symphony of creatures hidden in the darkness. Frogs croaked in deep unison, cicadas buzzed in restless rhythm, and somewhere out there an alligator splashed, the sound sharp and violent before silence closed over it again. Every few miles a bird called, a high, mournful cry that echoed and faded into the distance, never fully revealing its source. Earl Jennings sat hunched behind the wheel of his 18-wheeler, hands locked tight on the steering wheel, cigarette smoke curling faintly from the ashtray beside him. He was 46 years old, though the road had aged him 10 years beyond that. His hair had thinned to the point of surrender, his knuckles swollen from years of gripping the wheel, and the bags under his eyes seemed carved into his face like permanent shadows. But his truck was all he knew. He had been running long hauls since his early 20s, back when the world seemed wider and the highways felt like veins of freedom. Tonight, he was hauling lumber down to New Orleans, taking the back roads instead of the interstate. It was a route truckers avoided at night if they could help it, not just because of the isolation, but because of the stories. It was cheaper, faster, quieter, but quiet didn't always mean peaceful. The cab rattled faintly with the hum of the engine, a low growl that had become as familiar to him as the sound of his own heartbeat. The headlights cast thin cones of light ahead, slicing through the humid fog that drifted lazily across the road. Beyond that narrow reach, the swamp pressed in like a living wall. The swamps whispered. Every so often, he thought he heard movement out there. Something shifting just out of sight. Branches snapping. Water disturbed. Sometimes he told himself it was deer, sometimes a gator. Sometimes he didn't bother telling himself anything. Louisiana's bayous always gave him the creeps. He'd driven through the Dakotas in blizzards, across the barren plains of Texas under a sun that could fry skin off bone, through the mountains of Colorado with black ice under his tires, but nothing unsettled him like the swamplands. It wasn't just the wildlife. Snakes, gators, wild hogs, those he could deal with. It was the weight of history in these marshes, the way the air itself seemed older than time, carrying voices of the past. Every trucker had heard the stories. Some swore they'd seen ghost lights, pale flames that drifted through the trees at night, luring travelers off the road until they drowned. Others spoke of drowned women, their pale faces rising out of the muck to call for help, their eyes empty and black. A few even whispered about things older than humans, creatures made of mud and bone and hunger, waiting in the waters for anyone foolish enough to step too close. Earl wasn't the kind of man to believe in ghost stories. At least, that's what he told himself. But tonight, he kept the windows rolled up, the cab lights low, and his eyes fixed on the ribbon of highway, like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to reality. His hand strayed to the radio, but he didn't turn it on. Country songs felt too cheerful, and silence felt too loud. He needed the growl of the engine, the steady beat of the tires on the road, something mechanical and certain in a world that seemed like it wanted to swallow him whole. The clock on the dashboard blinked 1:37 a.m. Earl rubbed his eyes, took a drag from a cigarette that had burned down almost to the filter, and exhaled into the stale cab air. He had at least another 3 hours before he could pull into a rest stop. He shifted in his seat, cracked his knuckles, and pressed the gas a little harder. The swamps pressed closer, and somewhere out in that darkness, something was already watching him. The night had a way of stretching itself thin, pulling seconds into minutes and minutes into hours. Earl's truck pushed through the misty road like a beast dragging itself across the swamp, but his mind wandered in uneasy circles. He thought about his ex-wife, Mary, back in Baton Rouge, thought about the son who didn't call him anymore, who probably didn't even remember the last time they'd gone fishing together. The road had taken everything from him, friends, family, health. All it had given him in return was miles, endless hungry miles. That was when he heard it. At first it was faint, so faint he thought it might have been the wind slipping through the trees, a high, thin sound. But the second time, there was no mistaking it. A scream, a woman's scream, sharp and terrified, tearing through the swamp air. Earl's chest tightened. He slowed the truck, tires hissing against damp asphalt, headlights sweeping wide across a curtain of fog. He rolled down his window just an inch, enough to let in the humid air, and there it was again, louder, closer, a cry for help that froze his blood. He pulled the truck over, the big engine rumbling like an uneasy animal. He sat still for a moment, fingers gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles whitened. His instinct screamed, "Don't go out there. Don't you dare." But then came the third scream, ragged, full of drowning panic. Earl grabbed the flashlight from the glove box, muttering under his breath, "Goddamn fool move, Earl, but can't just drive past." He stepped out into the swamp night. The air hit him like a wet rag, thick and warm, heavy with the stink of stagnant water and rot. His boots sank into the shoulder of the road as he aimed the flashlight into the trees. The beam quivered across trunks wrapped in moss, catching ripples of water, the gleam of unseen eyes shining back at him for half a second before disappearing. "Hello?" His voice cracked. "Anybody out there?" Silence. Then movement. 20 yards away, out in the black water, something thrashed. His beam caught a pale hand, fingers clawing upward, splashing, fighting against some invisible current. A woman's face surfaced, gasping, her hair slicked against her skin. "Help me," she choked, before the swamp swallowed half her words. Earl ran forward, mud sucking at his boots. "Hold on, I'm coming." But as he neared the water's edge, the thing happened. The hand jerked, the woman's body yanked sideways with unnatural force, like a puppet on a string pulled by something far below. Her scream bubbled, cut short as she was dragged under. The water exploded with ripples, then went calm again, eerily calm, like glass laid over a grave. Earl froze, chest heaving, sweat dripping from his brow despite the night air. He swept the flashlight beam over the water, desperate for bubbles, for anything. But there was nothing, just still, black swamp, as though she had never been there at all. The frogs had gone silent. The entire swamp seemed to hold its breath. Earl stumbled backward, his throat dry. Whatever had pulled her under was no gator. He'd seen gators hunt. He'd seen the thrashing, the rolls. This was something else, something that claimed her in one swift motion, as if the swamp itself had reached up and taken her. His hand shook so badly he nearly dropped the flashlight. And then, in the silence, a single ripple spread across the water, slow, deliberate, before vanishing again. Earl turned and ran. He slammed the door shut and locked it, gasping for breath as though he'd run a mile. His heart pounded in his ears, his shirt stuck to his back with sweat. The cab smelled faintly of old coffee and diesel oil, normally a comfort. Tonight, it smelled like a coffin. He jammed the keys into the ignition, the truck roaring awake with a shudder. The vibration of the engine was a small relief, a reminder of steel and machinery, things that made sense in a world that suddenly didn't. Earl shifted into gear, tires spitting gravel as he lurched back onto the highway. The yellow lines blurred under his headlights as he pressed the gas, faster, faster, until the swamp rushed by in a green and black smear. But the smell came next. At first he thought it was the swamp clinging to his clothes, but no, this was different. Stronger, a stench like rotting meat and wet earth, sweet and putrid at the same time. His eyes darted to the rearview mirror, nothing but the cab behind him, the worn-out bench seat, his jacket tossed in the corner. Still, the smell grew stronger. His breath quickened. He flicked the mirror down, his throat tightening. Something moved. A shadow hunched in the back of the cab, half hidden, shifting in the gloom. The flashlight slipped from his trembling fingers and clattered onto the floor. "Jesus Christ," Earl whispered, his voice almost breaking. The shadow rose slowly, unfolding itself, and what stepped into the pale glow of the dashboard lights made his stomach drop into ice. It wasn't a woman. It wasn't even close. It was slick, mud-covered, its skin pale and swollen like something drowned too long. Its hair hung in clumps, dripping swamp water onto the seat. Its eyes were black pits, glossy and empty, staring at him with hunger older than mankind. The swamp thing had followed him, and now it was in his truck. The cab of the 18-wheeler became a cage. Earl screamed, slamming one hand against the door handle while steering with the other. The creature lunged forward, the stink of swamp and decay filling his lungs. It grabbed at him with long, claw-like fingers, skin slick with algae and mud. Earl swerved, the truck fishtailing across the narrow road. His fist lashed out, connecting with its face, but it was like punching wet clay. Get out, he bellowed, as though the thing could understand him. The truck rattled, horn blaring as he slammed one hand against it in panic. The monster's mouth opened, water dripping from between its teeth, too many teeth, sharp and jagged, like broken glass embedded in flesh. It hissed, the sound like bubbles rising from deep underwater. Earl fought, elbows striking, knees driving upward, his body thrashing in the tight space. The wheel jerked, the truck swerving dangerously close to the swamp's edge. Lights appeared ahead, another car. Earl yanked the wheel, narrowly avoiding collision, his horn blasting. The driver must have thought he was drunk, insane, but no one could see what he fought inside the cab. The creature's grip tightened around his throat. His vision blurred at the edges, black spots dancing. His hands scrambled for the gear shift, for anything. His fingers found the metal thermos, wedged in the cup holder, and he swung it wildly. It cracked against the thing's skull with a dull thud. It recoiled, hissing louder, water spraying from its mouth. Earl gasped for breath, coughed, then stomped the gas pedal to the floor. The truck roared, barreling down the swamp road at reckless speed. But the creature didn't let go. It climbed fully onto him, its cold body pressing against his back, its claws dragging across his chest like knives. Earl screamed again. The swamp outside blurred into a tunnel of shadow and mist, trees whipping past in dizzying streaks. Earl could barely see the road through the haze of fear and pain. The thing's claws sank deeper into his skin, drawing blood. His breath came ragged, lungs burning. He tried to throw it off, twisting violently, but its grip was unbreakable. The monster whispered, not words, not human sounds, just a gurgle, a wet croak, like something speaking through water. The noise wormed into Earl's ears, his mind flashing with images he couldn't explain. Bodies floating face down in the swamp, faces pale and bloated, eyes open but unseeing. He saw the woman again, the one who screamed, her hand reaching out of the water, her lips moving. Join us. No, Earl roared, thrashing harder. Get the hell off me. The truck swayed across the road, wheels spitting gravel as it barely clung to the asphalt. Headlights carved wild arcs into the trees. But Earl was losing. His arms weakened, his head lolled forward. The swamp smell filled him, seeped into him, as though the creature's very breath was sinking into his blood. It pressed its mouth closer to his ear, the sound of gurgling water rising louder, louder, until it was all he could hear. And then it struck. Its jaws clamped onto his shoulder, teeth piercing flesh, water spilling from its mouth into his wound like venom. Earl screamed, a sound ripped from the bottom of his soul. The cab shook with the violence of it. The wheels spun out of control, and the swamp thing began to feed. The truck veered off the road, headlights flashing across black water before the tires caught the shoulder again. Earl tried to fight, tried to keep control, but the creature's weight pinned him. His vision blurred, the world dimming. The last thing he saw before darkness took him was the swamp rushing up to meet the road, trees leaning inward like silent witnesses. Then nothing. Silence. When his eyes opened again, he wasn't behind the wheel. He wasn't anywhere at all. He floated in water, cold, endless water pressing against his chest, his arms, his face. He opened his mouth to scream, but only swamp water filled his lungs. Shapes moved around him, pale faces, hundreds of them, suspended in the murk, their eyes locked on him, their mouths whispering soundlessly. The drowned. They reached for him, their fingers brushing his arms, his face, pulling him deeper. He tried to fight to swim upward, but there was no surface, just black water stretching forever. His chest burned, his mind screamed. And then, in the darkness, two black eyes opened. The swamp thing loomed before him, its mouth curling into something like a smile. It opened its jaws and the water swallowed him whole. Morning came to Louisiana with a heavy fog that blanketed the swamps in pale gray. The highway was quiet, empty, except for one lone 18-wheeler rolling steadily south. Its cab was dark, windows fogged from within. The driver sat hunched over the wheel, face hidden in shadow. His hands gripped the wheel too tightly, knuckles pale. His clothes dripped faintly, as though still wet. Those who passed the truck that morning swore they saw something wrong with the driver. His head didn't move. His eyes, when visible at all, were black as oil. The truck roared through the mist, past the bayous, past the moss-draped trees, and in its wake the swamps whispered again. Another trucker had joined them, and the swamp had found its way onto the highway.